Have you ever played one of those military-type board games where you're looking down on a map or topography and there are certain forces arrayed and each team, each group is vying to control territory? So maybe it was a board game like Risk, maybe it was even chess or Go, maybe you've played an online video game that lets you conquer territory, or perhaps even you've done a LARP, live action role-playing. All the same, within that context, the most important thing is to have a map. It's to have a visualization of the topography. And in the artificial general intelligence, or AGI wars, we haven't had that until now. We've had all sorts of bits and pieces. We know who the big players are, of course. We know all of that. We know what they're bringing to the battle, so to speak. We know who their key people are, their chief generals, if you would, in their organizations. But it's been a little bit hard to get that cohesive whole. Now today we're going to create that. Now throughout this whole exercise and ongoingly, we're going to use Sun Tzu's The Art of War as our organizing framework. And that's going to give us a rational way for considering everything that we're doing. So for example, if one team, so to speak, if one AGI organization, corporation, makes a certain move and part of us wants to say, ew, why did they do that? I wish they hadn't. When we take a look at it from the point of view of the art of war, it makes sense. It might in fact be the only allowable move that makes sense. So Sun Tzu's The Art of War is going to give us a lot of contextual understanding. And the value of this to you is the following. First of all, you get that top-down visualization. You understand the context for the various moves that the players will be making. Secondly, it's going to give us something of an ability to predict moves. Not 100%. This is not a predictive game. But it'll give us an ability to understand the pressures that various organizations or corporations are under and what they must do in order to achieve certain goals. Third, it helps you, whether you're a CEO, Chief Technology Officer, Chief Scientist, or if you're an investor, or if you're a chip manufacturer. This can help guide your thought process. Equivalently, just as much, if you're leading a research team or even just planning your own AGI career. As Sun Tzu said in Chapter 5, The Art of War, whether you're dealing with a large force or a small, the same principles apply. It's all a matter of scale. So you, if you're just planning your course of study to learn AGI and launch a career or adapt your ongoing career for AGI, or all the way up to you're commanding a multi-billion-dollar company and you're moving your major organizational elements into play, same principles. So we're going to have fun with this. We're actually going to have a marvelously good time, and we'll have so much fun carrying this forward because we'll be able to project and see how things evolve. Now today we're looking at the major players, the big positions, the major interactions, and we'll fill in details later. We'll fill in some of the smaller pieces as we go on. We're not going to have much time today to look at hardware. We're not going to have time today to look at very specific technology implementations. We're after the big topographic top-down view sense. We're after clarity, insight, coherence in our point of view. So welcome in. I'm Dr. Aliana Marin. I'm the founder and chief scientist with Themesis Incorporated, founder of the Themesis Academy, your muse in artificial general intelligence. Now before we get started, let me invite you to go to the description box below. Click on the link to the associated blog post. For most videos that we offer from Themesis, we have an accompanying blog post. The blog post will have certain key slides. So often when I'm going through and you get a slide from the B-roll and it's only up for like a few seconds and you could be saying, I wish that was up there for half a minute or more. I really wanted to study that. Go to the blog post. It'll have those slides, and it will also have links to prior blog posts, prior YouTubes, where you can go through that in more detail, because I do pull together materials that we've already used in over 2 years of presentations by now. So use the blog post, and we have, by the way, a lot of references there, all nicely formatted at the end if you're using them for academic purposes, but you get all the links to everything that I'm discussing. So it's a convenient and useful resource, and I'm organizing it in the order in which we have this conversation here, so you should be able to follow through what we're doing and track the progression through the blog post pretty easily. Secondly, why not just pick up an online copy of Sun Tzu's The Art of War, and when I mention something specific, like I say, Chapter 5 or Chapter 2, you can quick pause and take a look at what Sun Tzu is actually saying and say, oh yeah, what's being said here makes sense. Do this as an ongoing strategy if you would. So if you watch this video and you're just going through it the first time, great, love you for it. So glad you're here, obviously. But on your second and third passes, because you're treating this as a steady device, do use the blog post and Sun Tzu's The Art of War as your accompaniments. And by the way, I teach at Northwestern University, have been teaching there for the past 8 years, artificial intelligence, 3 different classes, the general AI and deep learning course that I innovated back in 2017, the natural language processing course, and an artificial intelligence specific capstone. And in that capstone, the only required text is Sun Tzu's The Art of War. Go figure. Alrighty, this is take 3 because there were technical issues with the shoot on this segment that I did yesterday. So this is actually the third take because there were technical issues the day before that. And I can't bring myself to say the same thing twice in a row. So what we're going to do is a little bit different than what was planned. So instead of doing this historical evolution of how the AGI landscape as it currently is formed, we're going to start with a little tiny overview of where it is now and then backtrack and do this historical. So here's the brief overview. There are 4 major players in the evolving AGI landscape. Major players, I'm not saying there aren't any others. And these are, and I'm going to go sort of top to bottom, not in order of predominance. At the top you're seeing RGMs, that's Renormalising Generative Models, that's developed by Friston and colleagues out of Verses.ai. They are focused more or less on spatial web. What that is an evolution of Friston's active inference. So they're looking at planning. Their most recent work is Pixels to Planning, 2024. This is the whole breakthrough that's causing us to say, okay, now we have some boundary structures on the whole AGI area. Okay. Next, going down in the slide, we're going to see a combination of OpenAI and Google, both of them putting, basically they're strapping on reinforcement learning, but it's really deep reinforcement learning, so you get latent variables, so it's not as limited as simple reinforcement learning. They're strapping it onto the respective LLMs, and they're showing some limited capability for quasi-symbolic reasoning. It's still pattern matching, and a lot of the recent investigations into the recent offerings are saying, well, you know, if you're doing a problem that is already in the LLM, it's part of the pattern that's been learned, then it can pretty much work its way towards a solution. But if it's tweaked even a little tiny bit, like a little nuance added in, or certain numbers are changed, or something to that effect, link in the blog post, go there. It was an Apple review of the 3 top ones. It was OpenAI, Google, and Meta. So, problems. Deep reinforcement learning strapped on still doesn't quite cut it. And then at the bottom you're going to see LeCun's work, Hierarchical, JEPA, Joint Embedding Predictive Architecture, H-JEPA. And LeCun, of course, with Meta, is, as opposed to Friston, who is very, very blatantly, openly, that is all generative, LeCun is blatantly, openly not generative. And Friston is also sort of state spacey. Imagine moving a knight in a chessboard. You go bump, 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 and you change the space in which that knight now inhabits a spot in the chessboard. LeCun talks about having differentiable world models, and to have a good differentiable model, we want something that is, you're remembering your freshman calculus here, smooth, continuous, thus differentiable. So very different approaches. They're all forming what I'd call that edge of the AGI space and pushing it further out into the ocean. Now, I need a moment of your indulgence. Okay. I was up at crazy early hours this morning reading the stuff. This time I was getting into Hofner. I was just saying, oh yeah, what is Google doing in reinforcement learning? Because, of course, Demis Hassabis, now Sir Demis Hassabis, Nobel laureate, wow, kudos to him, and to his team. And it had nothing to do with reinforcement learning. That was off in the AlphaFold direction. Talk about this some other time. But the thing is, Demis Hassabis, Google, DeepMind, and reinforcement learning, probably the world's best repository of reinforcement learning knowledge and people and expertise. So I wanted to dig into that a little bit. And I remember reading some Hafner papers. That's Daniger Hafner, who was the lead author on that paper, Action, Perception, Divergence, which was with Carl Friston. That was about 2 years ago. And that was pivotal in the AGI positions and players vid that I did, I think it was back in April. So I was looking at Hafner papers and noticing once again there was some oddness in not so much what was being cited in the reference, it was what was not being cited. I just have to go here with you. I took notes. Let me share this. This is so, it's just going to give you chuckles, I swear. Okay, so you start off with looking at LeCun, his Path Towards Autonomous Machine Intelligence 2022 paper, but it's version 9. He's been at this for a while. This is not his first time at the rodeo. Okay, this is a beautiful paper. I'm going to put together in the blog post. Okay, where all the good stuff is going to be 5, let me put this here, 5. I'm going to select 5 key papers, things where we should maybe center our reading if we're going to say, okay, I give up. I'm just going to have to immerse myself in AGI because it's the way things are going. LeCun's paper, Path Towards Autonomous, etc., is going to be central. And he's got a great couple of things in there. He's got a very broad-ranging discussion, contrast and compare, on generative versus JEPA. Okay, we want to read that. Some very useful commentary regarding, well, it's part of the generative thing. There he's taking a direct discussion, shall we say, we're being really nice, discussion with Hinton's contrast of divergence approach. And then he's also talking about reinforcement learning. So there's these points of comparison, and that's what we're after. You know, we don't want to silo our knowledge. We're trying to look at how do these things stack up. So of course he introduces hierarchical JEPA, and it's very useful. And he's talking about representing world states at different levels of abstraction. So he talks very explicitly about hierarchical planning, and even though he doesn't use the phrase pixels to planning, it's in there, because he's talking dominantly about taking imagery, for example, as a sensor input, and then abstracting up there to world models and representations of what's really in that scene. He has 3 citations of Hafner's work. It's very nice, very congenial of him. Not a single one for Friston. Let's go on to Hafner. Okay, I'm pulling 2 Hafner papers. 2022, Deep Hierarchical Plans or Planning from Pixels. 0 citations of Friston, 0 citations of LeCun. Let's go back in time. 2019, Learning Latent Dynamics for Planning from Pixels. Now look, this is important stuff, okay? We want to learn latent representations. And if we're going to do planning, we absolutely need some latent representations, because it's not going to just happen with the, as it is, just the pixel-based representations. This is important, and it's learning our latent representations is important no matter what approach we're doing. 0 citations of Friston, again, 0 on LeCun. Okay, so Hafner and colleagues, they're in their own little isolationist bubble, despite the fact that in 2022, I think it was 2022, he, along with Friston, along with 4 others, all very established, prominent researchers, very, very competent and capable, put out that Action, Perception, Divergence, which was a brief moment in time, a little rapprochement between Google and Friston, still at UCL, University College London, so there was no corporate competition there, and then others in various other academic spots, as well as Google's DeepMind. So that partnership between, of course, Hafner and Friston is, of course, dissolved, because Friston is now with Verses.ai, and Friston, recent paper, 2024, Pixels to Planning. My goodness, aren't we all, like, we're talking about the same thing all the time? Pixels to Planning, Scale-Free Active Inference, 2024 paper. Well, no mention of Hafner. One mention of a Lillicrap paper, 2015. Hafner's not involved in that one. But Lilycrap with Google DeepMind, very established researcher doing good work, and very congenially, one mention of LeCun, 2005, LeCun's MNIST paper. Guys, really? Really? So, okay, everybody's doing pixels to planning. We're all trying to get from whatever our sensor data is to a representation of it with some latent variables to a capability where we can build abstractions so we can do hierarchical planning and reasoning. That's what we all want. And everybody is pretending that they're in a universe of themselves and nobody else. Even when you have papers that have magnificently esoteric references to things that I've never heard of before and will probably never follow up. Okay. So pixels to planning. Everybody's trying to figure out how to go from sensor data to a world model, and from the world model to planning or a series of abstract hierarchical representations from which we can do planning. Now you'll notice, won't you, that the big fat elephant, the elephant in the pink tutu, dancing around in the center of the room, that really doesn't exist in anybody's mental space because we're all blithely ignoring this elephant in a pink tutu. And by the way, I'm showing you an image here. It's from Dreamstime, because I was doing a little search just for fun and saw this beautiful generative AI elephant in a pink tutu. And you know what? I'm refusing to buy that one because I don't think that the original image generators are going to get paid. So Dreamstime it is, and you will notice, if you would please, that every time I give you a stock photo image, there's a little credit to the author there. So unless I'm making it up myself or using a public domain and combining that sort of thing, it's going to be credit the original artist. Why not? Let's do our part for humanity here. Okay, the elephant. It's the symbolic computing. And everybody's blithely ignoring this elephant. And LeCun is just flat coming out and saying, we don't really need symbolic computing. I have enormous respect for Professor LeCun. Brilliant mind, and he's been at this, God knows, for well over 40 years. I mean, he invented the CNN in 1989 with serious creds in the community. But I disagree with him. I think that symbolic is important. The reason that people aren't talking about it is that we haven't figured out how. We haven't figured out that neuro-to-symbolic bridge, which we will discuss by the end of this vid, so I urge you to stay with me. So here we are, the edge of AI. The edge of AI, the rollout into the Pacific Ocean, the AGI border is going top to bottom. Just because I've drawn it this way, no particular reason. We've got Friston with Renormalising Generative Models. We've got variations on the theme of deep reinforcement learnings, and then we've got Hierarchical JEPA. The two companies with major LLMs that they are attempting to bring into the inference realm are using deep reinforcement learning. Of them, Google has the deepest entrenchment, having purchased DeepMind several years ago, and even before they purchased it, Demis Hassabis and colleagues had seriously invested in building up their intellectual capital. So if we're going to take a Sun Tzu moment here, Sun Tzu talks about things that are very relevant to this movement. And I'm not even talking about the recent Nobel Prize. That was a crowning glory. So when we read Sun Tzu, he talks about, first of all, not engaging in a prolonged siege, not having prolonged warfare that's just going to diminish your resources. When we look at Google and OpenAI, they could be in that kind of a conflict because they're after the same terrain. Sun Tzu talks about gaining the high ground. In this case, we're thinking intellectual high ground, not so much a product that you've rolled out, but the intellectual capital. And in that, they've got it because they acquired DeepMind early in the game, and Sun Tzu talks about the value of capturing an enemy's army whole, that it's better to capture an enemy's land, to capture the army whole, without destruction to people and property, because then obviously you can start to harness that wealth. And that's precisely what happened when Google did a corporate acquisition of DeepMind. And I would say it's also what happened when they did a corporate acquisition with Hinton earlier also. So Google's had more time in the game, more ability to build up strategic resources, and now it's giving them leverage. Good to know. OpenAI, they're getting investment, but it takes time to build a team where the team understands each other, they understand the resources, they understand the methods, they know what works, what doesn't, and they've been able to go at problems with their resources over a period of time. OpenAI is coming to the battlefield late. Sun Tzu talks about getting to the battlefield early, positioning yourself well. So Google has already gotten into the battleground early. They've got the most high ground. They've got the greatest resources. They're better positioned. And let's mention, even though I mentioned that elephant in the room that we're all blithely ignoring, even though Google has been abjectly ignoring its knowledge graph ontology people, as far as I can tell, and I don't know if it slashed those people from the payroll or if there's still a skeleton crew left or what's going on, but Google still has the deepest knowledge repository, knowledge graph in the world, and that's significant. So Google has tremendous advantages. OpenAI, despite recent investments, is also hemorrhaging money, not to mention brain talent. So OpenAI, not in as good a spot. But of course, time will tell. Now, further on down at the bottom of our figure, we're showing Yann LeCun's H-JEPA, Hierarchical Joint Embedding Predictive Architecture, at Meta, but that is not focused primarily on Meta's llamas and whatever animals they bring into the game, but rather, once again, LeCun is looking at representing sensor-level data, taking it into a world model, building abstractions, and from there being able to do hierarchies that allow planning. Okay, everybody's trying to build hierarchies and do planning. Of these three primary approaches, RGMs, deep reinforcement learning attached to an LLM, and JEPA or H-JEPA. Two of them are very much aligned towards that which you can observe in the sensor world. And from there they're trying to build world models and do hierarchical planning. The difference between them, predominantly, in Friston's approach, RGMs based on active inference, you're using a generative model, out there, blatantly, openly generative. In LeCun's approach, just as blatantly and openly, not generative. When you go up to Friston once again, he's talking largely about state space models. And when we look at some of the planning that they've done, it'd be to things like games where individual elements in the game have a specific position that you can move about. When we look at Google's DeepMind work, a lot of their reinforcement learning, a lot of their evolution over the past several years has been with video games. They are looking at very, very similarly state space planning. When we go down to LeCun and he's looking at sensor data, he's talking about continuous models. He emphasizes the need to have differentiable world models so that you can apply control mechanisms that require operating in a differentiable space. So we have these three major models near at hand that are being the basis for what we're doing right now at the emergence of AGI. I'm not saying that this is going to define the final frontier, it's just how we're stepping into this. So number one, from the top of the list, we've got Friston RGM's active inference. Number two, we've got Google and OpenAI, each of them using deep reinforcement learning strapped onto an LLM. Then we go down to Meta, where LeCun is the proponent of H-JEPA, which is a pixels to planning mechanism that is not generative, whereas Friston's definitely is, and works with a continuous state space or world model that is differentiable, whereas Friston's is more chunky. We've got these three methods. To some extent, this isn't absolute, but to some extent, the early successes in this AGI realm will depend on model maturity. To get an assessment of that, we're going to take a look at the evolution. So I'm going to invite you to look with me at the early stages of how the whole AI landscape evolved. This whole idea of modeling the AI landscape on the Oregon Trail of AI came about as I was trying to teach students in the Artificial Intelligence and Deep Learning course that I introduced, Northwestern University Master of Science in Data Science program 2017. And some of the things were easy. Backpropagation, easy. Paul Werbus' 1974 original split between neural computation and symbolic. Jan LeCun creating CNNs with Yoshio Bengio. That's pure backpropagation, propagating through layers. They took Kunihiko Fukushima's early idea of a neocognitron that had suggested Hebbian learning in each layer and made it work more effectively by using backpropagation, trained through multiple layers. Very effective, still to this day a useful tool. Reinforcement learning. If you look at what Bartu and Sutton have to say, they point to 1979 as where they get their original thoughts. Interesting, isn't that? In fact, quick little story here, Paul Werbus was among the early funders of Bartu and Sutton. We're talking early 1990s, and I know this because Paul was funding my work at the time also. We would meet at conferences. I and the company founder at the company where I worked at the time would sometimes go to DC and visit with various government program officers, including Werbus, talk about our research, listen to what they had to say. Times like that were where Werbus would share what he thought was important, and he always spoke very glowingly of Bartu and Sutton and was one of the earliest to give them the financial boost that they needed. Early start for Bartu and Sutton, reinforcement learning. Reinforcement learning gained a great deal more strength, credibility, traction, shall we say, as Demis Hassabis and his colleagues who founded DeepMind obtained early funding and did early work with it, again typically looking at game situations because they figured that in this kind of a constrained, very structured environment, they could easily build out those utility functions that would allow them to study how to best build reinforcement learning mechanisms. So when Google acquired DeepMind, there was a strong core of capability, and then Google's further investments brought that even to a greater richness. So reinforcement learning has definitely had a long period of development, and if we compare that against active inference, which has just recently evolved into RGMs, reinforcement learning has got some decades of prior work. Active inference, I would point to some of the most significant early work with Friston as 2010, and then further work 2013, 2015, where it got a little bit more gelling. There's been about a decade plus a few years cultivating active inference, compared to what I'd call at least 3 decades worth of active work in reinforcement learning. So it's no surprise that it's much easier for the main companies to be using reinforcement learning right now. And Verses.ai is taking a bit more of an adventurous, exploratory approach by adopting Friston's approach. Similarly, Jan LeCun, tremendous history with that man. He's got decades of work. He's been cultivating his ideas for a long time. So he's got strength and support behind him, having worked at Meta for quite a while. So what that means is that in order, just a simple rank ordering of capabilities, we can see that reinforcement learning, greatest time and grade, so to speak, maybe JEPA next. And then in terms of having money to build it out, colleagues who understand not only theoretically but actual systems and applications, active inference, now morphed into RGMs, is the newest in the game. But the evolution of AGI isn't going to depend just on those 3 models, because one way or another, all 3 models have some relationship to generative AI. And it's in generative AI that we first encounter a shift in moving from the relatively simple elements of basic AI, that would be backpropagation, then layered backprop in the form of convolutional neural networks, and then reinforcement learning, which still has its roots out in what I call the prairie grass country of AI. In order to move into generative AI, we need to go through what I call the Donner Pass, the Sierra Nevada mountains of AI, and the Donner Pass, which is that confluence of the 3 elements that are needed in order to have generative AI. And those 3 elements are, first of all, we have the reverse Kullback-Leibler divergence. That's where you compare the model against a set of observations. Secondly, you have Bayesian probabilities. specifically the probability of the latents given certain observations. And that is essential. The introduction of latent variables and the conditional Bayesian probabilities is what makes it generative. And then a little origami folding, and we come up with an equation that looks suspiciously like a statistical mechanics free energy equation, which we then minimize, and that negative entropy curve, the negative concave entropy, is what gives us the ability to drive towards that free energy minimum. Now, very important here, at the very initiation of using that approach, that combination of three elements to create generative AI, which is consistent across all forms of generative AI. That would include the Boltzmann machine, the restricted Boltzmann machine, everything that descends from that, all the GANs, deep learning, then variational autoencoders, then variational inference, which does not use neural networks at all. There are no nodes, there are no internode connections. Instead, you've got a model that you are bringing closer to your observations. And then transformers, which takes us back to a neural network, where you do have nodes, you do have connections. The original Vaswani et al. Paper has no mention of any of these elements that I've described. It's a very mechanistic approach, but if you probe deeply enough, you'll find all these elements. You'll find reverse Kullback-Leibler, you're going to find the Bayesian conditional dependence, and you're going to find the statistical mechanics. I address this in other videos and in blog posts, and I will try to put a few links into the blog post here. If you're interested in more, if you want me to build out the description, please leave something in the comments below. So, all generative methods sharing these three fundamentals. That is so essential to our understanding of how AI works at its fulfillment right now. We've got the LLMs, generative methods, that are based on this, and everybody is doing the same thing more or less. They're using the same model, and the reason that I bring this up is that we are all aware of the limitations of LLMs these days. Not going there, we know that already. The thing is, we will not build an AGI out of a generative AI in a simplistic sense, simply because the power of a generative AI system, especially as you put it into an LLM, is its ability to generate. So you give it an initiating pattern and it generates the next step, and then it auto-regressively comes back and adds that in, and you generate and you generate and you generate and you generate. And you keep on generating next steps in this pattern completion sequence, and that's what it does. Fundamentally, no matter what we put on top, whether it's a RAG, retrieval augmented generation, where there is reinforcement learning with human feedback, RLHF, or whether it is a deep reinforcement system that we're attempting to use to bring in inference, it's still, the baseline is just this simplistic generative capability. Pattern generation, token generation, with no understanding of the symbolic connection that these tokens might represent. And that's the inherent deep weakness. That's the elephant in the room that we're not addressing. To get to AGI, despite what certain people may think, even though I have great respect for them, we're going to need to get that symbolic. So let's take a look at that. So it's clear that we're coming to the end of our story, because we're now at the big problem. How are we going to actually create AGI? We've seen the limitations of LLMs plus reinforcement learning, deep reinforcement learning. We've seen that we can build abstraction hierarchies with JEPA, H-JEPA, and RGMs. But if you take a look at what LeCun is saying he's not at all interested in the symbolic component. And you can take a look at all of the work by Friston and colleagues. It's a little not quite focused on symbolic. And the efforts by the LLM companies, even coupled with deep reinforcement learning, are clearly not going to get us general AI. So what are we going to do? Let's go back to that island lost in the mists out in the deep Pacific. That's the symbolic AI. We know that we need to connect. We just can't fake it anymore. We can't just keep pushing more and more connections and patterns down the road in an LLM and hope that layering an inference engine on top of it is going to give us actual symbolic level thinking. And there are all these subtleties and extra capabilities involved when we do real AGI that we're not going to pull. And I think that people are finally, very begrudgingly, very unhappily, beginning to realize that and saying, okay, we are going to need a different solution. And of course, that solution is what's being called these days the neuro-symbolic connection, which hasn't really existed because it's so very, very hard to connect things from this very flickering on-off token stream that is the signals that we would use to the actual symbolic level ontologies where we want to have sustained activation of various ontology elements. Now, that in itself, a whole different discussion for another day. What we're after right now is how to build that connection. Think of it as, if you would, building a sky bridge. We want a sky bridge to connect between the Gold Coast of California out to this island in the midst of the Pacific. Hasn't existed until now, except that there is a method. Very, very quickly. I've been talking about statistical mechanics throughout for a reason, because statistical mechanics uses an equation. It's called the free energy equation. Simple linear combination of two terms. Transformers work beautifully well because essentially they take an elaboration of one term. People haven't known how to do the other term. They haven't known how to play with it in a useful way because it doesn't involve parameters in the sense that we usually use them in neural networks. But there is a method, and it's called CORTECONs, content-retentive, temporally connected neural networks. And on that, surprisingly, I'm going to go through a chart with you. It'll be a voiceover, and I'll be doing that voiceover sometime in the dead of night when there are no fans and no chickens and no construction sounds in the background. And you and I can take a moment and peruse it at our leisure. So here's that chart. We're going to use this mostly as an organizing framework because most of what's here we've covered already. I'll just touch on a few points. And of course, yes, I'm putting this into the blog post. Let's first give our attention to the near-term future. I'm recording this in mid-October 2024, and let's take a look at what is likely to happen over 2025. And once again, let's turn to Sun Tzu. We can see that we have four major competitors, and of course this is a very simplified diagram. It's not including all of the major LLM players, including the recent addition of Ilya Sutskever's SSI, Safe Superintelligence, that got started within this last year. So all of these LLM players, and we're including, by extension, capabilities such as vision, code, math problem solving, all of that. But for simplicity, we're just going to refer to these as the LLM teams. They are all using essentially the same algorithms and competing in the same space for the same clients. Now, Sun Tzu talked about the importance of foraging on the enemy. In terms of what we're dealing with right now, current state of the generative AI community easing into AGI. Foraging on the enemy translates into bringing in some revenue stream from the space that you're already in. It's essential that each of these companies garner some revenue, and we're seeing the difficulties that are being addressed by even the major players, such as OpenAI. Even though they're getting investment funding, they're spending at a near equivalent rate. Companies such as Google that do have internal dollars to spend still need to be extremely careful about how they're expending their resources, and we can see from recent layoffs within these major companies, Meta, Google, others, they're still in the process of tightening things up so they can harness the greatest internal revenue possible to focus on their generative AI and, we trust, AGI. But investments alone aren't enough, whether they're external or internal from the home company. We know that these companies each need to be gaining revenue. In order to understand the situation a bit more, let's return to Sun Tzu, where he talks about 9 varieties of ground, beginning with dispersive and facile ground, and moving on, we're going to note open ground, and then the various kinds of ground get progressively more difficult. So by the time that he reaches the end of these 9 types, he's talking about serious ground, difficult ground, hemmed in and desperate ground. When we take this notion of different kinds of ground back to our metaphorical journey, we notice that when generative AI via transformers gained an enormous boost with their emergence of ChatGPT in November 2022, in just under 2 years, we went from that original gold rush to a situation where we were massively expanding. So it wasn't just gaining control of territory that already existed, it was building out that territory as they developed capabilities. In Sun Tzu terms, we describe this as open ground. This was the open ground stage for OpenAI, Google, and other early entrants. But as more and more players entered into this game, this ground became more contested. It's quickly become first serious ground, where each of the companies has managed to penetrate to at least some extent into the generative AI terrain and create new terrain in the process. Then has become difficult ground, where it's been harder and harder to make progress and to gain advantage. Take as just an example the extent to which companies are building out larger and larger LLMs with increasing costs associated with each build-out. Now, though, I'd characterize the situation for these major LLM players as somewhere between hemmed-in ground and desperate. And the reason is that the notion of hemmed-in ground implies that it's very difficult to maneuver. The terrain is exceptionally challenging, and what's going on now is a combination of two things. First, too many players in the area. What used to be open ground and sunny skies has become, metaphorically, a bit smog-filled with the impact of the compute and energy-gobbling resources required. But more to the point, this notion of being hemmed in is due to the fact that we now have these two methods involving hierarchical planning, both the RGMs and the H-JEPA. I've portrayed these as being somewhat mountainous for a reason. They provide a boundary. They are, so to speak, trapping the LLMs within an isolated area. And this is why two of the leading LLM companies have resorted to using deep reinforcement learning. Think of it as a narrow river gorge that can gather up momentum and burst out between the mountains. Now, we know that reinforcement learning is only capable of being a narrow AI. Reinforcement learning, no matter how deep, isn't going to give us full-scale AGI. But it's what we have right now, and there's a huge need to burst out of the confines of this hemmed-in, trapped, competing with other LLMs for scarce resources, and losing money every day situation. So the impetus is on, and these major LLMs are bursting out because they must, because it's survival. So let's close out with just a couple of comments. First of all, of the methods that are available and on hand right now that have the potential of leading to some sort of intelligent capabilities, even if very narrow, reinforcement learning, specifically deep reinforcement learning, is in the lead, and Google has the deepest resources there. Three of the major LLM players, Google, OpenAI, and Meta, have serious money that they've been able to invest in their capabilities. Verses.ai, recently some investment, but it's not as well funded. Themesis, of course, is scarcely a dot on the screen. Of the four companies with the leading methods, we knew that Google and OpenAI are attempting to build inference on top of their generative models, and the likelihood is that within 2025 they will come out with some sort of specialized, very focused AGI, very narrow, but still likely to be useful for certain tasks. In contrast, LeCun speaks to the role of H-JEPA potentially in autonomous vehicles, and since Meta's recently released their Orion glasses, there's possibly a role for H-JEPA in that capability also. Verses.ai is focusing on edge AI, so we'll likely see some sort of deployments there. And again, these should be near-term wins, probably something within 25 and early 26 as well. In terms of having a basis for complex reasoning, though, just putting reinforcement learning, no matter how deep, on top of a generative model isn't going to give us real complex reasoning. It's not going to give us AGI. It's a placeholder. It's something to grab a little bit of revenue. As Sun Tzu said, forage off the land, forage from your enemy. It's something to get a little traction, while hopefully they're doing the real work on AGI way in the back. LeCun's H-JEPA has a lot of power and a lot of promise, but it still is dealing with how do you convert from sensor data up to a hierarchical representation of that sensor data, which allows for some planning, but not really a bridge to symbolic computing. Finally, for Verses.ai, focusing on edge AI or spatial web. We can envision them incorporating some form of planning capabilities into edge-based AI reasoning, but it's still going to be limited. There's nothing in their current approach that leads us to think that they're going to make a good connection with symbolic AI. Now, you may have noticed that I was giving high marks to active inference in terms of its AGI potential as compared to the other methods that I was ranking as just mid to low. And the reason is that active inference is a potentially far more powerful approach. It allows for a combination of two behaviors, at least, investigating or exploring the environment in which the system finds itself. Say it's an agent that can be tasked with getting information from its environment or acting on its environment, or alternatively, that same agent can be tasked to do goal-seeking behavior. This is more flexible and more robust, more far-reaching in its capability than reinforcement learning. So over time, I expect that active inference and then the hierarchical version of active inference encompassed in RGMs will emerge as the leading method. Not quite the means to do neural-to-symbolic connection, but exceedingly powerful for tasking agents within an environment. So here we are, very likely near-term wins for everyone in the game simply because it's a survival necessity. But are we going to have real AGI out of what's on the table right now? Not really. But can we create AGI using active inference, along with, of course, astute use of what we already have, and combining this with CORTECONs, which will facilitate a neuro-to-symbolic connection? We've discussed CORTECONs in multiple vids. There are playlists available, and of course I'll link to them in the blog post. And of course we'll be releasing more vids in the near term that will discuss how this neuro-to-symbolic connection can be indeed facilitated through using CORTECONs. The breakthrough is going to happen when we connect our connectionist, our neural network, our subsymbolic elements to our ontological, and at the ontological end, we're representing what our thoughts are in terms of having some context around and attributes towards and even beliefs associated with certain entities, events, places, things that is so essential for AGI. So we're going to pick up with this again soon. For today, thank you so much for joining me. Once again, Aliana Moren from Themesis. Have a lovely day. If you found this material useful and interesting, we invite you to pursue this further with us. We have a wealth of material to offer, ranging from playlists of YouTubes and, of course, their associated blog posts, rich with references, to book chapters, to various papers, including privately published tutorial papers that are very helpful if you're teaching yourself generative AI, up through and including archive and journal papers. Just a huge wealth of resources. We also offer short courses, and for those of you that truly want to move into this area, we can work with you as your corporate muse. But if you would please check the blog post, we link to playlists, and we link to extensive resources built up over the past couple of years that provide a grounding, a tutorial, if you will, in Themesis's CORTECONs capability, which, in terms of maturity, CORTECONs are most comparable to where Hopfield and Hinton were when they introduced neural networks based on the Ising model in physics. Hopfield, of course, making that first introduction, and Hinton bringing in the generative capability. That was taking a pre-existing physics model, the Ising equation, and reinterpreting it for use in neural networks. Similarly, what I've done in the CORTECON invention is to take a pre-existing physics model, the cluster variation method developed by Roichi Kikuchi and refined by Kikuchi and Brush, and reinterpreting it for use in a neural network's AGI context. But more than that, we'll leave to a future vid. We have some lovely little exercises that you can do very easily, very immediately, and they'd be a fun way to get started. If you'd like to have Themesis become your corporate muse, please visit the Themesis website, check out the Muse page, and please follow protocols. That's most important. Also, to stay informed of releases, especially in our short courses, which would certainly help you if you need or if your team needs to get up to speed on the statistical mechanics fundamentals necessary to understand generative AI, please do visit our Academy page, and please also sign up with us. Go to Themesis at themesis.com, scroll down, find that opt-in form, do the opt-in thing, move the emails to your preferred email list so that you get updated, so you can take note of the opportunities as we share them with you. And thank you. It's been lovely to have this moment with you.